Everyone feared the arrogant billionaire until a waitress humiliated him in front of everyone. Nothing in San Mariel was ever as quiet as the dining hall of El Jardín Real when Eduardo Montero walked in. That night, the air itself seemed to know. The glasses clinked with less conviction. The waiters spoke with softer voices. Even the wall clock seemed to slow down. And then, at 8:47 p.m., he arrived. The revolving door spun too fast. A cold draft rushed in before him, but quickly lost its relevance. Eduardo Montero crossed the room not as someone who walked, but as someone who commanded. Flawless suit, hardened gaze, a presence that crushed everything around him. 3 men followed silently, as if they were extensions of his own body. The central table was already waiting, reserved as always, because it was always his. He sat down without greeting anyone, like a bored king before a banquet. And everyone, employees, guests, even the pianist in the corner, understood the message. That night belonged to him. Across the room, Camila Duarte watched in silence. She was new there, 2 months on the job, still got lost in the kitchen corridors, but she already knew who he was. The stories spread like urban legends, but without exaggeration. None of them sounded false. Men fired for the smallest mistake. Women insulted with words no one dared repeat. Broken plates, tips tossed like arms. She had never seen him before, and now, there he was. The manager scanned the room, looking for someone to take table 7. His eyes landed on Camila. She simply nodded. There was no time to choose, no way to avoid it. As she walked across the room, the space seemed to expand around her. Each step echoed as if being judged. When she neared the table, she felt the side glances, some wary, some calculating, some amused, all except his. Eduardo Montero didn't look at anyone. His arrogance didn't require an audience. The first interaction wasn't an order, it was a test. Camila realized that the moment he lifted his chin and looked at her as if she were a poorly crafted piece of furniture. He ordered his meal without enthusiasm, as if the dish didn't matter. His tone was always the same, controlled contempt, every word a reminder that to him, everyone there was disposable. Camila did her job with precision. She didn't bow too much, didn't force a smile, but she didn't show hostility either. Steady, quiet, but alert. The dish was served, a grilled sea bass with sweet potato puree and citrus sauce, the house specialty. But for Eduardo Montero, taste wasn't the point. The food was just another backdrop for his performance. He looked at the plate, then at Camila, and with a sudden movement, he let a piece drop to the floor. He looked at her as one might throw bait, waiting for humiliation to happen naturally. It was a subtle gesture, but cold. The kind that steps on something invisible. The entire room felt it, a collective shiver, a silence as heavy as concrete. Camila looked down at the piece of fish on the floor. Then she lifted her gaze. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The command was implied, hierarchy speaking on his behalf, and for a few seconds, everything stopped. Her throat went dry. She felt every eye piercing her back, the weight of the moment pressing on her decision. But there was something inside her that refused to yield, something that grew in proportion to the insult, a silent dignity hardened by life that would not kneel. Instead of bending down, she stood tall. She didn't say a word, didn't justify herself. She just looked at him the way no one else dared to. Then, with calm movements, she took the nearly full plate and turned it over onto the table. It wasn't aggressive, nor theatrical. It was deliberate, almost ritualistic. The sauce spread slowly across the white linen cloth. The sea base slid among the meeting papers. The glasses trembled. The room froze. So did Eduardo Montero. The man who was used to being feared didn't know what to do with the silence that followed. Camila stepped back, her hands steady, her chin lifted. There was no anger on her face, only resolve, and that, to him, was far worse. For a moment, no one breathed. Then he stood. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor thundered through the room. The fury in his eyes was visible, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. He spoke, but his voice was too sharp to be heard as words. It was an attack, a threat, a verdict. And still, she didn't move. The tension was so thick it felt like the ceiling was collapsing over everyone. Then a sound broke through. Footsteps from the kitchen. Mr. Almeida appeared, hesitant, eyes wide. He seemed smaller than usual, his face pale, his breathing short. The restaurant owner, who always lowered his head when the tycoon appeared, he stopped at the doorway, looked at Eduardo, then at Camila. The silence stretched for a few more seconds, the longest of the night. And then something different flickered in his eyes. He took a step forward. For a moment, everything hung in suspension. The table was stained. The food was dripping between the papers. The tablecloth ruined, like the image of control that Eduardo Montero cultivated everywhere he went. And there stood Camila, still, steady. The woman who, in everyone's eyes, should have already fallen apart. But she didn't. Eduardo still didn't speak. What he lacked in words, he made up for in contained hatred. The veins in his neck bulged. His eyes, those of a wounded predator, unaccustomed to the slightest resistance, let alone a public defiance. The humiliation burned hotter than the stain spreading across his documents. Camila didn't look at him with defiance, nor with anger. She simply held the posture of someone who refuses to bow. The entire restaurant saw it and felt something new take shape in the air. A tension that stopped being fear and began to feel like hope. Eduardo finally spoke, but he didn't shout. His voice came out low, dark. He said he would destroy that place, that he would turn the restaurant into ashes, that he'd put every employee out on the street, starting with her. But his tone wasn't that of a man giving orders. It was the tone of someone trying to reclaim an empire that for a moment was slipping through his fingers. Camila didn't respond. She didn't need to. The gesture had already spoken for her. And that was when Mr. Almeida stepped toward the table. Slow steps, trembling hands, his eyes fixed on Eduardo, but filled with something new, shame for having stayed silent for so long. For years, the owner of El Jardín Real had bowed his head. He had accepted the yelling, the abuse, the veiled threats. He had tolerated the outbursts of fury because the Montero name brought prestige and fear. But there, in that moment, he saw something he wasn't used to seeing, courage. And it didn't come from someone powerful. It came from someone ordinary, someone who had nothing to lose, and yet refused to lose her dignity. Almeida stopped beside the waitress, took a deep breath. His voice came out hoarse, but it came out, "No one here works to be humiliated." It was like a silent explosion. Some employees froze mid-task. Customers set their silverware down. The entire dining room suddenly felt smaller. Everyone was watching, waiting, unable to believe that someone, the owner, was breaking the silence. Eduardo stared at him like one looks at a traitor, but Almeida didn't back down. "This restaurant isn't yours. It never was. Neither you nor your money rule this place. And if I'm going to lose everything, let it be with a clean conscience." Camila closed her eyes for a second, not out of fear, but because what she heard meant more than it seemed. She wasn't alone anymore. And then the unexpected happened. A subtle, almost imperceptible movement. From the corner seat, André Montero, the magnate's nephew, lifted his eyes. He had been there the whole time, quiet, discreet, always in his uncle's shadow, observant, silent. The kind of presence that learns never to interfere. But that night, something in him shifted. The image of the powerful man he had admired for so long now seemed smaller than the young woman who simply refused to kneel. Eduardo looked at him, expecting support. But André remained still. The silence between them was different, heavy, old. as if it carried years of things left unsaid. And then, without raising his voice, André broke the balance. "You think you're feared, uncle, but the truth is, no one respects you." It was like breaking glass with bare hands. Eduardo stepped back, half a step, not physically, but in his gaze, in his posture. Something inside him collapsed. The boy to whom he had given a last name, a company, a position, was now exposing him in front of everyone. There was no longer a submissive audience, no longer enough fear to hold up the throne. The room, once ruled by tension, was now filled with something stronger, a silent admiration for those who dared to speak. The customers began to move, slowly, a nod here, a discreet smile there, a barely perceptible gesture of approval toward Camilla. No one clapped yet, but the feeling had been planted. Eduardo looked around and saw no more allies, only firm faces, straightened shoulders, and the complete absence of submission. For the first time in a very long while, he didn't know what to do, and that destroyed him more than any words could. This was a fall without noise. No scandal, no police, no headlines. Worse than that, it was being disarmed by the simple act of no longer being feared. Eduardo Montero picked up his folder, its papers stained with sauce, straightened his jacket with an automatic gesture, and, without another word, turned to leave. His footsteps didn't echo with force. They didn't draw attention. They were just the steps of an ordinary man, trying to slip away before anyone realized he wasn't as great as he seemed. Camilla stood there watching. There was no pride on her face, no revenge, only a vast calm, the kind of peace one feels after defending what is right. And when the door closed behind the magnate, the sound that followed wasn't surprise. It was liberation. The silence that followed. Eduardo Montero's departure seemed to have weight. It was no longer fear. It was something deeper, something only felt when an old structure collapses before your eyes. The dining hall of El Jardín Real didn't return to normal. Not right away. People still stood frozen, faces still carried disbelief. But behind every expression, there was one shared feeling: relief. And at the center of that new emptiness stood Mr. Almeida, upright, beside Camilla, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the floor stained with sauce and crumbs. His breathing wasn't calm. It carried the weight of years, swallowed in silence. He wasn't a weak man. He never had been, but he had spent too long pretending that strength meant neutrality, that staying silent in the face of power was a sign of intelligence and not of cowardice. For years, he had let Eduardo Montero sit at that same table. He had watched the rudeness, the humiliation, the veiled threats. He had watched and said nothing. He justified it to himself as survival. The restaurant depended on reputation. The suppliers, the contracts, even the licenses, everything could be taken away with a single phone call. So he stayed quiet, and every time he stayed quiet, something inside him went quiet too, until that night. Camilla was still there, standing firm, like a shadow that refused to fade. That girl, barely 3 months into the job, had done what he had never found the courage to do. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't waited for justice. She had simply refused to bow her head. And because of that, something inside Mr. Almeida broke open. In truth, what he felt in that moment wasn't anger at Eduardo Montero. It was anger at himself, at every excuse, at every tip accepted in silence, at every broken plate swept away without complaint, at every employee who quit, suffocated by an environment where abuse was tolerated in the name of convenience. There, standing amid the fragments of a wounded empire, he finally understood. What destroys a place isn't the oppressor's shout, it's the silence of those who watch. And he had been the keeper of that silence for far too long. Camilla's eyes met his for a brief moment. There was no reproach in her gaze, no pride, only what she had shown all along: resolve. And that's what disarmed him. The dining room began to move again, slowly. like a body coming out of anesthesia, learning to move once more. Customers rose from their tables carefully, as if expecting one last outburst of chaos. The waiters whispered among themselves, still digesting what they'd witnessed. But underneath every movement, a seed had been planted. Respect, not for Eduardo, for Camila, for Mr. Almeida, for everyone who in some way had broken the logic of fear. Andre Montero remained seated for a while longer. The young man who had followed his uncle like a discreet shadow for years now sat facing a broken mirror. He had turned against his own blood. He had said aloud what many thought but no one dared to declare. There was no going back from that, and yet there was no regret in his face. It was as if finally he had discovered where he truly stood. Mr. Almeida walked toward him. Andre lifted his gaze. A second of silence, then just a mutual nod. Nothing needed to be said. They both knew that in different ways they had left their masks behind that night. Camila bent down to pick up the tray from the floor, not out of submission, but because it needed to be done. Every gesture of hers was composed, measured, restrained, and perhaps because of that, even more powerful. When she walked toward the back, the other employees stepped aside. One by one, discreetly, they touched her shoulder, nodded, exchanged quick glances, as if recognizing in her something they all wanted to rediscover in themselves. Dignity. Mr. Almeida remained in the hall for a few more minutes, watching. The restaurant had survived, but he knew nothing there would ever be the same. Nor should it be. And deep down, he wanted it that way, because fear may bring profit, but respect is what builds a legacy. The night never went back to normal. Not after that. The dining hall of El Jardín Real kept running, waiters serving, dishes leaving the kitchen, silverware clinking against porcelain, but something had changed. Something in the air. Something in the way everyone looked at each other, as if suddenly courage had become contagious. Eduardo Montero didn't return. He left the restaurant without looking back, stiff with the pride of someone refusing to accept his own downfall. For a man who ruled through fear, there was no greater pain than being ignored. And that night, he was. There was no scandal, no press, no shouting or public disgrace. He simply lost his voice, lost control, lost the persona he had upheld for so many years through rage and threats. And worst of all, he lost to silence, to a simple act, because Camila didn't need to shout to win. She simply refused to bow her head. That was more than defiance. It was a mirror. And in that reflection, Eduardo Montero didn't see power. He saw fear, his own. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, stories began to take shape. Someone told someone else. A customer sent a message. A discreet recording found its way onto social media. The images had no sound, just the gesture, the plate being overturned, the sauce spreading across the table, the paralyzing silence filling the hall. And that look, Camila's look, steady, calm, without a trace of hesitation. The city of San Mariel woke up the next morning with a new name circulating in cafes, offices, newsrooms, and bakery counters. It wasn't the name of a politician, nor a businessman, nor a celebrity. It was the name of a waitress, Camila Duarte. Some didn't understand, others doubted it, but many felt something strange when they heard the story, something rare these days, genuine admiration, because everyone at some point has stayed silent before someone like Eduardo Montero. Everyone has pretended not to see, has endured quietly, has wanted to speak up, but didn't. Camila did, and that was enough. Mr. Almeida rebuilt the restaurant, changed policies, revised contracts, gathered the team. For the first time, he made it clear that no one there would ever work in fear again, not because he wanted to avoid trouble, but because he finally understood the price of silence. Andre Montero, meanwhile, disappeared from the news for a while, but rumors said he broke away from his uncle's empire, started something of his own, a smaller, quieter company. No one knew the details, but those who saw him later said he looked different, lighter, more human. As for Eduardo Montero, His name lost its weight. Gradually, quietly, partners ended contracts, invitations stopped coming. The facade of respect evaporated, and what remained was only a shadow of the man who once thought he could step on everyone without consequence. He didn't fall with scandal, he fell with silence. And maybe that's why it hurt more. Camilla didn't give interviews. She turned down invitations, kept working for a few more weeks. Then she resigned. Not because she was pressured to, but because she knew her time there had served its purpose. On her last night, she left the restaurant with her folded uniform in her arms. The night air was cold, but her soul peaceful. She took no souvenirs, only one certainty. She had done what many wouldn't have, not out of reckless courage, but because she knew dignity isn't negotiable. At the corner before turning away, she stopped for a moment, looked back, the restaurant lights still on. The city still awake, but everything, absolutely everything, a little different now. There was no audience, no applause, but deep down she knew, you don't need fame to make history. Sometimes all the world needs is someone who stands tall, when everyone expects her to kneel. If it were you standing there, would you have the courage to stay on your feet? Type "I would" or "I'm not sure" in the comments. If this story truly moved you, leave a like and subscribe. It helps more people hear what fear tries to silence.